Now, I'm going to be talking about African traditional religion, and this is a term that scholars, philosophers, religious scholars use. And it just refers to a commonly held set of beliefs in the sub-Sahara. So that's kind of another disclaimer. When I say Africa in this talk, I'm referring to the sub-Sahara. Northern Africa kind of has its own traditions. Um, And African traditional religion, or ATR as I'll sometimes call it, it's really a synthesis of views. Um, Now it's always a little bit tricky because when you talk about a synthesis of views, um, on the one hand, you're kind of homogenizing um, set of beliefs of people, but on the other hand, you want to recognize just how diverse the African continent is. So I'm not claiming every people group or indigenous people group has this set of beliefs on the continent. I'm just going to read a quote by Metz because I think it's helpful. So he says, when writing on Africa, one is expected to try to avoid stereotyping by acknowledging the existence of variety and particularity among its 54 countries and its thousands of linguistic and ethnic groups. However, there appears to be enough common ground among sub-Saharan Black peoples, or at least their academic exponents, for many African philosophers and social scientists to speak of an overarching belief system routinely called African traditional religion in the literature. Um, so again, I'm not claiming in this talk that everyone has these beliefs, but the at least African academic exponents do talk of this thing, African traditional religion, and there does seem to be commonality of at least some beliefs across um, the tradition. So I'm going to focus on concepts of soul, immortality, and the afterlife. Um, in going through my slides in terms of order, it wasn't clear to me the best order to put this in, so I'm sorry if it comes across as a little bit haphazard, but I'm trying to sort of introduce these concepts and their relevance. I'm not sure there's kind of a best order for doing that. Um, so I kind of work across different traditions. So I was kind of trained in the Anglo-American philosophical canon, and then kind of got interested in the African tradition. So if that's of interest to you, you'll notice that these concepts are very different, or at least definitely not the same as what one finds in the Abrahamic faith or the Judeo-Christian tradition. I'll sort of highlight some of those differences along the way. Um, so just briefly in terms of thinking about God. So many people, at least in the West, if you ask them, uh, what are the major monotheistic religions? Everyone will say Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I think there's actually a fourth. So African traditional religion is quite clearly monotheistic. It posits one God that is the creator and sustainer of the universe. Um, Interestingly, there's kind of a debate right now about the divine attributes. So um, some will say God has maximal goodness, knowledge, and power. This is similar to the Abrahamic tradition. Others affirm what's called the limited God thesis, and there's all sorts of literature coming out on this now. And this thesis says instead, God has the most knowledge, goodness, and power of any being, but not necessarily maximal. There does seem to be agreement that God is immutable, so that these these characteristics don't change, but there's kind of a debate on the divine attributes right now. And of course, if you're interested, you can quickly realize that the limited God thesis is going to have implications, right, for the sort of arguments for and against God's existence, and you can see right away there would be implications for the problem of evil. Um, and if you go on a site called philpapers.org and just punch in African limited God, you'll get a bunch of hits and recent hits. This is something people are working on. This isn't really going to be my focus, but just by way of background. Now, from what I can tell, in ATR, there's not tons of agreement on kind of the specifics of creation and sort of how the universe came into being, but there is agreement that God is the creator, God's the first cause or responsible for the existence of the universe. I do not, unfortunately, read or speak any indigenous African language, but there's some scholarship that says many in many languages God literally just means creator, so there's synonymous or even the same word. Um, Another interesting feature here is that some in this tradition also think God created ex materia, or out of pre-existing material. And again, this differs from the Abrahamic faith, where God created ex nihilo, or out of nothing. And though every human dies, obviously, in this tradition, it's a bit vague, but it seems like at least some think the universe is eternal moving forward. It had a beginning, but it's not going to have an end. So that's kind of just a little prelude to kind of the main concepts I want to talk about. So um, mortality is something that most major world religions try to explain. And in this tradition, you get different myths purporting to explain death or why people die. Um, so one tradition is that God had thought to endow humans with immortality, but it was somehow lost. So you can read these stories of an animal sent to deliver the message of immortality. It gets delayed or something happens, and the second animal delivers the message of mortality, and it unfortunately arrives. There are also stories similar to I should have said Judeo-Christian one here, where early humans eat a forbidden fruit and receive death as a penalty. So very similar stories to the book of Genesis, and there are extra biblical stories from that period that are similar too. Interestingly, in doing a little bit of kind of extra research for this talk, I noticed that there are even some myths about losing the gift of resurrection. So it's not as if resurrection is this, um, Christianity would be the most famous, but it was curious to me that there's purportedly some very old myths about losing resurrection in this tradition. Now, the causes of death will also differ on this view. So a natural death is actually considered quite rare in this tradition. So old age can sometimes be considered the cause of death, but it's rare. And so um, I'm kind of inferring this, but from what I can infer, death is usually thought to be the result of some sort of mere moral or spiritual um, calamity, if you will, or something going wrong. So um, a departed ancestor, which I'll talk more about in a minute, but they're thought to be a conduit for God. Um, so sometimes it's thought, so you've displeased an elder, and so you've brought an illness upon yourself. So this is kind of a person's moral failing. They've brought this on themselves. But in other cases, they might have been the victim of sorcery or evil spirits or curses. So if you're familiar with the term witch doctor, this is where you might go to a witch doctor and ask for help. But you can see here on the slide the causes, you know, it's not thought to be a random act of nature that, you know, you end up with a tumor or something that causes death. It's not thought of in this way. Now, I kind of went back and forth, debating with myself whether to include some slides on what's known as life force, or vitalism. I ultimately decided to because I think some people think about the African tradition and think animism, and animism's kind of one of those. It can mean a lot of different things in different contexts. And it's interesting that scholars of ATR actually don't typically use the word animism because I think they think it carries baggage, and I think they're probably right about that. So I wanted to include a few slides on this just for clarification. So um, life force, or sometimes vital force, or just vitalism, it's this idea that everything that exists, including animate and inanimate objects, so humans, spirits, non-human animals, flora, fauna, minerals are imbued with an imperceptible energy known as life force. So this comes from God. All force flows from God. Um, God has the most life force, followed by things in the spiritual realm, so ancestors, the departed dead, humans, animals, etc. If you've heard of this phrase, the African chain of being or the African hierarchy of being, this is where that phrase comes from. So God is at the top. So there's a life force implies a hierarchy. So if you've heard the chain of being view before this, the visible universe. Um, so the goal of I mean, one way to think about life force is that it's normative or has normative implications. So it's this imperceptible energy, but the goal of life or the goal of morality on this view is to increase your force in oneself and others. There's some debate about whether you should really worry about your own life force, but um, just assume both. The characteristics associated with life force are things like creativity, vibrancy, health, reproduction in this tradition, um, a lowering or degradation of life force is associated with illness, submission, depression, lethargy. Um, these things I think are at least somewhat intuitively compelling if you think about which set would you rather have, right? Which traits would you rather have? There's something intuitive about this, I think. Um, okay, so if someone develops their life force over a long period of time, this is associated with virtue, and it makes it more likely that they'll become an ancestor when they die. I keep saying I'm going to get to this, and I promise I will. Um, Now, this is where things get a little bit murky. So, life force, as far as I can tell, is not thought of as a soul, at least in the Western sense of this thing that is you or identical with yourself. So, when I say personal identity, I mean that thing that makes you you over a period of time, right? I don't get the sense that life force is equivalent to personal identity. Um, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. I think there it is reasonable to talk about as soul on ATR. I think that that concept does exist, but I don't think it's life force or vital force. I think this is a distinct concept. There's debate about this. Um, Now, I talked about God placing humans at the center of the visible realm. And so one thing that's interesting, if you're Western or Northern Hemisphere, you might think in terms of there's a spiritual world and the physical world, or there's a material world and an immaterial world, spiritual, non-spiritual. You might kind of think in terms of this binary. Um, I think the Christian and Islamic tradition thinks in this way often. This is not the case in African traditional religion. So there's just one world, but there are visible and invisible elements, but all very much the same realm. So this language of kind of otherworldly or spiritual dimension just doesn't make sense on this view. And even in some sense, the term religion in a way doesn't really make sense. It's kind of religion is just integrated into ways of living and as a distinct thing. Doesn't really make sense. And this kind of nicely maps onto this visible and invisible idea, I think. So moving closer to what I really want to talk about, when a person dies, they don't depart to an immaterial soul. So in the Christian tradition, you might think there's a soul that leaves the body and kind of goes elsewhere. But for ATR, when a person dies, they remain in the same world but are invisible. Um, and I prefer spirit here because I think soul, maybe this is just my own idiosyncratic bias, but I think soul has kind of a Western bias in this context. But um, when someone dies in this tradition, this spirit or their soul, if you like, detaches from their body but remains quite close to it, and they remain very much a part of the world. They're just invisible. Um, Uh, and so the term for this when a person dies is the living dead. Now this might sound strange, but the reason is they remain very much alive in some sense and a part of their community and are remembered by a handful of generations. So um, uh, now, if they're remembered for a long time, longer than a handful of generations, and if they're especially revered, say, by more than just their immediate family, they would become a departed ancestor. Now, there's some debate and ambiguity about, what's the difference between a living dead and an ancestor, and I think there's enough kind of literature to suggest there's a clear normative difference between the two. I have at least one African colleague who doesn't buy this distinction. But in either case, they were an invisible being that is close to the community, um, and they're considered to be the same person as they were when they were alive. So there's personal identity, and again, by that I just mean the thing that makes them them, whatever that is, spirit, soul, is considered very much to be alive and nearby. And that's why the term living dead in this context makes sense. Um, People in this tradition will often talk about a family member as if they're still alive and nearby. They will have conversations with that family member. Thought I spoke to so and so today. Um, Now, Um, Ancestors are viewed. So one thing I maybe should have said is on this tradition, God is viewed as quite um, distant from humans, and it's almost viewed as rude to pray to God directly or petition God directly. So some of the monotheistic religions will emphasize your ability or need to have kind of personal closeness to God or a relationship with God. Some traditions will talk in this language. This is not the case in ATR. That's considered almost rude or disrespectful. And so a departed ancestor is thought of as the conduit for God or delivering kind of the normative or moral or spiritual things that should be done that are coming from God. Now, this has led, um, I think it's actually being corrected now, but in the 18th, 19th, even 20th centuries, you would have anthropologists and sociologists talk as if these indigenous Africans worship their ancestors and they go to their graves and give gifts and pour out libations and they really worship the dead in this tradition. And this is simply a mistake. And many indigenous Africans are in print saying this is a mistake. Ancestors are revered in this tradition because they're viewed as conduits to God, not because people think they are divine. And there is a difference here. So um, I think ancestor worship is just a mistake to talk about ancestor worship, at least in um, with what many people would say worship is, right? If we're just talking about respect, that's fine, but worship means something more than that typically. Um, Now you might wonder, I've talked about, living dead is kind of remembered for 4 or 5 generations, and they're still part of their community. So what about immortality? I suggested immortality was lost, right? Um, As far as I can find, immortality does not exist on ATR. I'm sure someone can point to some counterexample to this in some text somewhere, but at least there's, if not universal, there's widespread agreement on this. I just don't think I can't find it of what I've read. And I think that the living dead continue to exist for as long as they are remembered by the living. After this, they become a nameless ghost. Um, and I think personal identity is lost when this happens. So the thing that makes you you, I think it kind of evaporates here. Now this might be um, open to debate, but I think if we're going to take personal identity as kind of a requirement for immortality, then I just don't see how we can have immortality on this view. Um, Now, if personal identity is not necessary for immortality, and I guess giving just my own biases on the table, I'm probably just too Western in just thinking that you need personal identity to have immortality. And so I just don't see how you can have it without it. If you drop that assumption, then I think maybe there's something to talk about here. But I don't get the impression that when people speak about the living dead or even the ancestor, they think, into the future forever, this thing will continue to exist. That's just not the sense I get. I think I've been speaking for maybe 25 minutes, so I want to talk about some philosophical implications now. So that's kind of a really quick overview. It's always difficult. I feel like you kind of start the talk by saying don't make too many generalizations about this diverse continent, and then I've just kind of made maybe generalizations. But I do think um, that summary is representative of at least a solid majority of some of the scholarship on ATR. Um, Now, you'll notice on this view that the meaning of life, if you adopt these views or for adherence, is not trying to achieve immortality. It's really um, about trying to increase your life force or vital force, and that's done in the context of um, the community. And so, if you hear the term African communitarianism or an African communitarian ethic, some of that comes from this, where strengthening your life force comes out of promoting and working towards social cohesion. Um, you might think ATR avoids problems associated with Western conceptions of immortality. Now, depending on your inclinations here, you might wonder, well, what's the problem with immortality? Like maybe you don't think it's a thing, but you would be happy if there was such a thing as immortality, provided it was in, a relatively good state. Um, if anyone's familiar with philosopher, 20th century philosopher Bernard Williams, so he wrote this article that talked about maybe it was a book chapter on a problem with immortality. So it would actually be boring. It wouldn't be good. It wouldn't be good to live forever. And so there's been this kind of philosophical literature that's emerged on would immortality actually be a good thing? Um, so boredom might be one worry, and repetition might be another, right? So some goods are repeatable, right? You want to do, if you eat some really good meal in a few days, if you got offered it again, you would probably still enjoy it. It's not as if a good thing is not always repeatable. Um, but forever or for infinitely many times, maybe that wouldn't be a good thing. Um, so I'm not purporting to evaluate this, but just supposing that you had this worry that maybe immortality is not such a great thing. Um, well, ATR doesn't have that problem. Now you get benefits associated with an afterlife in the sense of life extension. You can pursue certain projects, perhaps repair or maintain certain important family relationships. Um, but you would avoid the boredom and repetition arguments. So maybe this is a philosophical upshot in broad strokes. Obviously, there's a lot more to say. Um, Now, this was just my speculation. I don't know enough about this. I should also say there is the concept of reincarnation does exist in the Sub-Sahara too. So at least the Akan people of Ghana do seem to have some conception of reincarnation. I think it tends to be with infants who die early are thought to come back, but um, so it's not as if everyone's being reincarnated, but the concept of reincarnation does exist. Um, but one thing I wondered about the doctrine of karma in the Eastern tradition, and I'm not someone who knows more about this than me would be able to tell me whether I'm way off base here. But personal identity, I don't think carries across rebirths. So you don't remember your past or previous lives, right? So you might wonder whether if your previous lives are impacting your current one, they affect your current status in the world. You might think, well, if I don't remember, or if I'm a completely different person, there's a worry about fairness in this, I think, that emerges. And this would be something that, if that is a worry, ATR also avoids. Um, but I'm kind of I would have to do a lot more reading. Um, Now, metaphysical naturalism, sometimes this is conflated with atheism, But just the view that there is no supernatural realm, there are no spooks, only the physical world exists, there are no god or gods, um, and there's no afterlife. So once your body dies, whatever makes you you also perishes. Um, this is probably the dominant view in the Western Academy right now, I would think. Um, some have thought that in the face of this pending non-existence, that life is absurd or meaningless, right? What's the point of all this if it's going to end? Um, others have said, well, non-existence or a firm end of life would actually be a good thing because it shows that our choices in the here and now matter a lot more. We have to make choices about what we value. If this is right, it would presumably apply to the living, dead, and ancestors, right? On the assumption that they don't live forever. So you might think ATR offers something of a middle ground between, a Western conception of immortality and metaphysical naturalism, which says that when your body dies, that's it. Maybe reaping the benefits of both while avoiding some of the worst implications. Um, so ATR would avoid the alleged meaningless of having no afterlife and the alleged problems of an eternal afterlife. Um, Now would have to offer a much more robust argument, but there's at least you can start seeing some of the potential philosophical implications when you start doing kind of cross-cultural um, comparisons. And at least from the tradition I'm coming out of, I don't think that we've even begun really to examine what this tradition means and could offer the rest of the world. And um, that's it.